Well, seeing as there's all this drama, with Ryan Falk and Sean Last, and that they apostatize from the alt-right, they apostatize from white nationalism, I'm going to say that the alt-right is dead. Now, a lot of people have been saying this for a while. I've been reluctant to say that it's dead. But my reason is different from the reasons that other people give. So a lot of people say maybe 3 reasons. So they will say it's the consequences of Charlottesville and everything that went on there. Or it's just that the alt-right was just a connection to the excitement for Trump's campaign, or that it was poor leadership. Now, of these 3, I really think that poor leadership is the most full of merit. But you gotta look at it in the sense of a lot of the alt-right indulged these people, these failures, in their e-celebrity status. The poor leadership, to me, is an effect of them indulging it, but it's kind of that an effect. The media did choose to deliberately focus upon Richard Spencer, Christopher Cantwell, Matthew Heimbach, because they're, these e-celebrity drama. They embarrass themselves, do not even talk about the issues at hand. But it's kind of their fault, the alt-right's fault, for focusing on them. The movement didn't try to fight back and try to point to, say, Jared Taylor or Peter Bremlow as more credible leaders. They just grossly indulged the e-celebrity aspect of these 3 people. But I really think that beyond this, that the core of its failure lies in problems stemming from nominalism and utilitarianism. Regardless, I want to point to Ryan Falk as this bellwether for this whole internet movement of the autistic right, the alt-right, the aught-right. So in 2008 and 2009, I got into the political circle of anarcho-capitalist YouTube community. And while never really contributing any YouTube videos myself, I still watched it pretty vividly. This community had Ryan Falk as one of its leading lights under the name Confederal Socialist, but also Mraku and Sean Last, who are also, in their own rights, pretty important and famous to the current alt-right. It had other figures which have faded away more or less, such as Junior Bacon Cheeseburger. In the end, I was right. Secular Numinist, Laughing Man OX, and Black Acid Lizard, among numerous others. This movement faded away eventually, and I don't really know what exists of it. If there is really any modern community of anarcho-capitalists on YouTube, or if it's exclusively something that died out in 2012, 2013. I don't really give a shit because, again, I'm Nazbol. I don't care about anarcho-capitalism other than the sense that it's interesting from, Slavoj Žižek interpretation of ideology and its consequences, so on and so forth. But to me, it always was that Ryan Falk and the Confederal Socialist channel was the most interesting part of all this, and he was its leader, at least implicitly. He always tried to have a systematic conception of anarcho-capitalism as a world system. And you can see this in a video like Anti-Capitalism at Light Speed. And he always was trying to tackle the problems inherent within the anarcho-capitalist world system, such as the free rider problem and the commons, and especially, I think, its most crippling problem, which is the free riders in national defense. And he wouldn't just, regurgitate Mises, he wouldn't just regurgitate Rothbard. He actively sought out his own answers, which he created himself, to solve these problems. And he said this, that he spilled up all this time, this emotional energy trying to solve these problems that are really inherent within anarcho-capitalism. And you can see this again when you go through his Alternative Hypothesis YouTube channel and his Alternative Hypothesis website, where he's searching for a solution within social science himself, alongside Sean Last, to the problems generated by the leftists when they attack racial realism. And that, to me, is why he was so important to the alt-right, because he's kind of this answers man. He's not necessarily the most important idea man, but I actually like him better as an ideal man I'll get into later. But he's this answers man that all these people depended on to defend their ideal. Eventually, the content that Ryan posted shifted towards human biodiversity, or race realism, or biological anthropology, if you will, if you want to call it that. That was what he focused on. He wasn't necessarily a white nationalist in a firm sense, maybe implicitly. He was highly utilitarian in that anarcho-capitalism allowed for unlimited discrimination, and that this discrimination, when used in regards to higher intelligence or creating a harmonious society based off of whites being able to interact with each other better, would allow for a society of much better utility. But the thing about it is, Ryan was essentially the only person really making anything resembling white nationalist or alt-right arguments on YouTube at that time. Like, really in 2008, 2000 to like 2012, 2013, he's the only thing that was talking about human biodiversity, talking about race realism. It was really beyond the pale at that time. You had people coming out of everywhere just attacking him. And you kind of see as the movement, the anarcho-capitalist community faded away, in 2012, 2013, these members, some of them have faded away entirely. The ones that didn't, Sean Last and Morocco, they really embraced, from moving this libertarian conception, they embraced the human biodiversity and started to shift towards a white nationalism. Now, Ryan ended the Confederal Socialist channel and started shifting towards, still libertarian, but shifting towards a pan-secessionist thing, where he started another channel, the All Nations Party, where he said that the United States had to be divided up into a great amount of nations inherent within the United States today, and that any nation or people that identified as such should actively be given the right to succeed at any time. Now, not explicitly anarcho-capitalism anymore. It was still a very radically libertarian approach. He eventually stopped posting videos on his channel and shifted onto yet another channel, New Europe A&P. This channel, which is my fan favorite, because he restrained from his previous focuses on just kind of focused on political ideology, a very materialist and nominalistic political ideology, and kind of the psychological implications of race realism, if you will. This channel certainly was not very popular compared to Confederal Socialists, and absolutely nothing compared to the popularity of alternative hypothesis today. But at the time, when the anarcho-capitalist community was dead and there still wasn't that many people online talking about this in any meaningful fashion, the seedbed that he created in that former anarcho-capitalist community started to come to fruit with the rise of the Daily Show, a podcast. And the podcast of the Daily Show and the website therightstuff.biz and the other podcast, Fashion Nation, were creating this internet culture which we now call the alt-right. And a lot of these people, including myself, the very initial people, a lot of younger people came in initially. I'm still pretty young myself compared to them. Some of them are still, Gen Xers. Ryan's like 5-6 years older than me. They were from, at least commenters on that libertarian anarcho-capitalist YouTube community. Obviously, Sean Last, Ryan Falk, and Morocco were. Eventually, after seeing the seeding of the right stuff and everything, and the rise of the alt-right, he then started the alternative hypothesis, which is by far his most popular work ever. And initially it was extremely focused exclusively on data, and it didn't talk anything about political ideology. Now he's shifted towards political ideology again, but it's still nowhere near the amount that he had at New Europe A&P. So you have this alt-right community rising up around 2014, 2015, that time, that's the genesis. And they're really growing because of all these memes coming from places like the Daily Showa and the Daily Stormer. And these memes are just given its spread. But the backbone of it is this data you got from Sean and Ryan, and then tangentially people go back to Jared Taylor, who's not really a part of it. They go back to the deceased Rushton, they go back to all these race realists to support it, but they don't have any teeth to this ideology. It's just exclusively defined by the negativity of what we're not. That we're smart. Blacks aren't smart. We don't want to be around blacks. We don't lie that much. Blacks and Hispanics lie more, so we want to be around them. We'll have better social cohesion. It's just a purely utilitarian understanding of politicality. There's no deeper meat to it. There's no real identity. The only identity is the negative identity of what we are not. We are better than them because we, on a spectrum, are smarter. On a spectrum, we lie less. On a spectrum, we're more trustworthy. And that's all that there really was to it. And now you're seeing around the time of 2015, 2016 especially, and then 17 where it blows up, figures like Cantwell and Heimbach and Spencer coming up to turn themselves ambitiously into political figures and transferring that internet phenomenon into real-life demonstrations. And then all of this blows up at Charlottesville, right? And, all three of them are connected to criminal behavior. It's just laughable. It's inertia. They decapitate the movement, and the inertia is horrible. And the doxing of Daily Shoah, and all these people leave it, and they just kind of become focused on it, put a paywall up, people stop listening to it, it just kind of turns generic. There's too many podcasts, they're flooded in the podcasts, so everybody's listening to a different podcast, they're going all over the place. See, this inertia is kind of becoming lost, at least to the Wikipedia history of it. Now, I have my own opinion of why this isn't really going anywhere. So I made it apparent on this channel that I'm a practicing Catholic. And Catholics are realists. And for myself, I go along the Platonic, very ultra-realist understanding of the world and metaphysics. I believe very adamantly in the existence of universals and the romantic need of people to believe in something that's higher than themselves. This world is a world of ideas. The true world is a world of ideas that exist far and above the physical world, and that's what allows the epistemological framework of human knowledge to even exist. This is opposed to the nominalism, which views universals and ideas only to exist from a shared consensus in the world between humans. There's no higher ideals, only what we claim. These ideals change and transform over time. We're not looking at the same thing together. We're looking at distorted kind of emergent chaos together. Now, I believe when we look at fascism and liberalism, communism, Islamism, every ideology that exists in the world, we're looking up at a universal towards the perfect or the ideal society. Most of the alt-right definitely does not. Most of the alt-right purely defines itself in a nominalistic and utilitarian reductionist idea of the ideal society doesn't exist. But what we can have is a society based off of preventing shittier stuff. So we let in less shitty people. White people are a less shitty people than black people. White people are less shitty people than Jews or whatever. And that's all we'll let in. And we'll have a higher utilitarian view of the world from that. So the idea isn't that we're going to share together as this great political movement, even though they're kind of forming this political movement with these marches and everything. We're going to just make a better society where black people don't break into your house and hassle you when you're trying to play video games. They don't hassle you when you're going to the grocery store to buy your tendies. That's really what the alt-right is about, preventing you from being hassled by blacks and Hispanics on your way to do your neat and autistic shit. And this is kind of where it comes down to, is that race realism doesn't have an ideology. It's just useful for arguing that we shouldn't have more, black immigrants, or arguing why white guilt isn't a thing. It doesn't present any real ideological reason to exist. It doesn't give any point, any unifying factor. What it will really argue is for Asians are better. The Japanese and the Koreans are the best. What's best for us isn't any ideology created in the world of abstracts. What's best for us is the Asian girlfriend state, right? It's high IQ nationalism or Honda Civic nationalism. That's really what race realism points towards, nakedly. Race realism has to be used as a tool. But when you have people like Ryan Falk and Sean Last and the people that connect as descendants to them, especially Ryan and super especially Sean in their modern forms, only see the world in a purely scientific and utilitarian fashion. They have no conception of ideals. Ryan is a very vulgar nihilist. He thinks that all morality is a spook. You shouldn't be surprised when they start becoming an apostate from your white nationalism, because to them, the entire time, white nationalism was only a utilitarian means towards their end of a harmonious society where they'd be less hassled by shitty people. And this, to me, is the problem of the alt-right, because it's only defined as a negative identity. We're white against the black. We're smart against the dumb. It doesn't define itself in what white Americans are. There's no conception of what white Americans are. There's no values, there's no culture, there's no religion. There's only, we're smarter and we lie less. Are you going to die for we're smarter and we're going to lie less? It's not something that people really want to stand up and die for. They don't want to be stood up and doxxed and lose their job for that. Especially when somebody like Ryan Falk and Sean Last will just abandon the whole thing because its utilitarian value makes less sense than the Asian girlfriend state. Okay, now let's contrast this with the burger-tard nationalism they always make fun of. What does the burger-tard nationalism have? The burger-tard nationalism has, in the proposition nation, the idea that we're a nation of immigrants. So if you look at something like Superman, Superman is the most important superhero, is the first superhero, the archetype of the superhero. Superman is also the archetype of the proposition nation and of the good immigrant, of the American dream. And this is ingrained in all Americans from birth by the very culture. So you see in Superman this immigrant who goes rags from riches. He is the most foreign you can be, but he resembles, an American, or he resembles a European white man, even though he's an extraterrestrial alien. So he lands in Kansas, in the most American of places, and he's adopted in a very Moses-esque style by this family. And he's encultured within America, and then he becomes this role model to become the defender of America, defender of America's values. And America's values are that you can come to America, you can flourish here as anyone in the world because of the values which America has. Now, this is a horrible idea, very destructive. This is what's destroying it, because at the Trump rally and everything, all these people, they're identifying with America nationally, and part of that is the proposition nation. It's the fucking stupid Emma Lazarus thing at the bottom of the Statue of Liberty. They identify with that because they're a nation of immigrants. They came here and seceded. Now, that's not true. 50-60% of European immigrants themselves weren't able to succeed here and left. And throughout the United States, in the majority of its history, there's very little immigration. I mean, it's just the boom after 65 and a boom between 1890 and 1920 or whatever. And these people were pretty heavily enculturated within the culture. Now you have the salad bowl where diversity is strength and all this retardation. But at the core is the idea of the proposition nation. And that's a very powerful idea. And it's, enculturated throughout, maybe less explicitly than the Superman story, with the superheroes, are very conquering genre, very American genre, which the Chinese and the Filipinos and the Russians and the Africans throughout the whole entire world, they're watching all these Marvel movies, and all these Marvel movies are about, all these diverse, special people that are contributing to American society and defending it. That's what the superhero is about. And there's no mythos in the alt-right. And there's all these mythoses within American culture that aren't necessarily as self-destructive as the rags to riches immigrant and the proposition nation. They're say Manifest Destiny and the founders, the brave founders. That's something that the alt-right could point to and identify with, which they have never had. They have never pointed to American history. They never pointed to American culture in any real significant way. and said, that's what I stand behind. And that's why they're failing. So if you look at Manifest Destiny, so you have the Pilgrims and you have Jamestown being founded, and against all odds, this little teeny tiny backwater colony on the back of the Atlantic Ocean up against the entirety of the North American continent. They have this Faustian will that they're light on the hill, and that they go forth and they conquer all of America. They take the land and they use it. Here in Manifest Destiny, in the tradition of it, you have this deep connection to blood and soil. In Manifest Destiny, you can point to figures. This will, this Faustian will that you will. I mean, people point to the Faustian will and laugh at it and say, that's the dildo! We gotta march further into the dildo. But it's really kind of like this will to conquer, this will to succeed, this will to invent, this will which had us push out the Native Americans and American Indians and acculturate them. And we colonized Mexico with our illegal immigration and made it American. Then we defeated the Japanese Empire and took the Pacific Rim for our own. Then we went and we won the space race against the Soviets and planted our flag on the moon. Now, why can't the alt-right have a triumphalism? Only back themselves up by saying, we're smarter, we're not as dumb as blacks, we lie less, we're better than blacks. Why can't they point towards the triumphalism and not just accept the corruption of the triumphalism inherent within progressivism and try to correct the triumphalism, try to win American culture back, and then connect Americans to their own white identity? Because the thing about it is, if you look at all this kneeling at the NFL, this is a perfect example of white Americans identify with America. Non-white Americans do not identify with America. They are identifying with that flag there. And the truth of the matter is, and this is in America, this is in your United Kingdom, this is in Germany, and all these places, is you have this sewage, this immigration sewage of these people that hate the country, but they're in the urban centers. So really, America is essentially this sandwich of the bread being not America, this foreign invaders. The meat and the cheese are America. The whites, the ruralites that live in between the urban coast, which makes up the bread, that is the salt of the earth of America. And here is where lies the white culture and the white people which identify with America and its history. And the alt-right is never, and it did not, and it has not, and since it's dead, it did not connect to this white culture and this white identity which is in the ruralites. And they really need, this is where NASBL in third position comes in, to combat these mega corporations because they want to destroy this identity of the ruralites. The ruralites are the real whites. They're the real white nationalism. That's the real identity. It's not these autistic numbers that say, we're smarter, we lie less, we don't commit as much crime on a spectrum. The real white identity is the people that are pissed off at the blacks that don't kneel before their flag, which represents them. That's where the white identity is coming from. And you have to connect with them. To have a transcendent romantic identity, the romantic and European nationalism which emerged after the French Revolution, you have to connect it to the real people there, the blood and soil. Now, I don't know what the future holds. Maybe it will be a pan-secession, and you'll have an independent South, and you'll have an independent Rocky Mountain states, and you'll have an independent Midwest, an independent New England, and then you'll have city-states like New York and LA, and that's where your multiculturalist dystopias will be. Or perhaps you'll have this civic nationalist kind of Singaporean nationalism where white Americans are 50 or 60% of the population, but they hold cultural domination like Russia did in the Soviet Union. Or perhaps maybe there will be an ethno-state emerge based off white nationalism. But whatever the future holds, it is not a nation made up of pure statistics, of pure cold statistics. It's a nation built from the reality of blood and soil and the people that live there, their history and their culture. Ryan's and Sean's apostasy, as well as the collapse of the alt-right, should only be viewed as natural because their assumption of white nationalism was purely from utilitarian grounds from the onset. It was an ideology of convenience, and it was not built from the romantic ideal of traditional nationalism seen in Europe from Napoleon marching forward. That's not to say there wasn't nationalism before that. It's not like medieval people didn't hate the next town before, but they're pointing towards this ideal, this universal beneath of the nation, and that's what unifies people. And this ideal is grassroots from the blood and soil of the real life of the people. And until a white nationalism embraces American identity as an ethnic American identity, it will not have any future whatsoever. And it has to combat this globalist world order that way. Now, the alt-right is going to recede and fade away, just as Gamergate receded and faded away, and as the anarcho-capitalism community before it receded and faded away. But it is attached to this rising sense of white identity that has been rising since the collapse of the Fukushima globalist dildo world order. And the alt-right's collapsing, but these populists are still winning. And for white nationalism and the populism to march forward, you really have to connect to the blood in the people of the white identity, which is fertile in America. And that is where you have a future, not in sterile statistics, even if they are helpful.